Why is legal pinging us at midnight about clause exposure? The CFO's voice snapped through the glass wall. I didn't flinch, just kept scrolling the covenant audit logs I'd been reviewing for the past hour. My badge still hung from my hip, half forgotten after Finance's little New Year stunt. If they thought a salary freeze was enough to make me disappear, they'd clearly forgotten who built the firewalls holding this circus of interlocking debt from toppling into SEC hell. That night, the building was mostly dark. Just me, a flickering espresso machine, and the dull hum of the servers that backed Garland Holdings' asset matrix. Every risk flag, every clause, every damn skeleton tucked into a shell company offshore. I knew them like scars, because I'd put them there, not as traps, as lifeboats, but only if you knew how to row. For nearly 10 years, I'd lived in the margins of their PowerPoints. Asset risk lead, never on the front slide, never introduced at earnings calls. But if a merger was about to get nuked by a forgotten covenant clause, they called me, always after the fact, always a little desperate. "Emily," they'd say, "can you check something for me?" And I always did, until January 2nd. That was the morning Finance pushed out their discipline realignment memo. Corporate speak for, "We're freezing your salary because you saved us too much money too quietly." One name was listed directly in the memo, mine. Everyone else got vague department-level nudges. But I got singled out. Senior Asset Risk Lead, flagged for inconsistent deal expectations. Inconsistent. Cute. That inconsistency they mentioned, blocking a $14 million credit facility that had hidden litigation exposure tied to a biotech partner under SEC review. I flagged it. They argued. I stood firm. The board backed me. Quietly, of course. And when that partner's house of cards collapsed 3 weeks later, Garland walked away untouched. Saved them over $4.3 million. And the thanks I got? A salary freeze and a passive-aggressive memo written like I'd been out of alignment with their vision. If you're enjoying this story so far, it'd mean the world if you liked the video and subscribed. Seriously, 97% of listeners never do, and it helps the team keep making these for you. Thank you. But back to the memo, I read it 3 times. Not because I didn't understand. Hell, I could smell the condescending italics from a mile away. No, I read it because I needed to feel the burn. I needed it to etch in. Then I closed the PDF. Didn't respond. Didn't schedule a meeting with HR. Didn't even tell my team. They were already stretched thin, covering 2 acquisitions and a client divestiture. They didn't need to worry about the house catching fire when they were still trying to reinforce the beams I'd built years ago. Instead, I opened my private schema archive, pulled up the asset interlock schedule. 5 years of mappings, entity exposure paths, trigger thresholds, cross-default vectors, each of them audited, notarized, and, because I never trusted a single soul above me, privately watermarked. At the time, I didn't think of it as revenge. I thought of it as insurance, because the thing about asset networks is this: they're not static. They're relational. One breach in a node and the dominoes don't just fall, they cascade. And the moment someone forgets which clause binds which shell to which bond issue, that's when the walls start leaking. I didn't leak anything. Yet. But I did run a silent scan. 3 issues popped immediately. Minor, on the surface, but linked together. Ticking debt grenades, I flagged them. Exported the scan. And before I logged off for what they assumed would be the last time, I uploaded a clean version of the interlock schedule into the master system. Time-stamped. Quiet. Unacknowledged. Then I placed my badge back in the desk drawer. No drama, no exit interview. The house was stable, but the wires were humming. I saw it while waiting in line for coffee. Still half asleep, hair damp from the freezing rain I'd walked through because someone decided Garland's parking garage needed renovations in January. The internal memo. 7:03 a.m. Subject: 2025 compensation. Alignment: tiered sustainability focus. Corporate blizzards always start soft. Refocus, alignment, adaptive thresholds. But buried halfway through the frostbitten nonsense was the only sentence that mattered. Due to inconsistent expectations and impact delivery variance, senior asset risk lead compensation will be frozen until further notice. Not performance concerns. Not pending review. Just a 1-line guillotine, first swing of the new fiscal year. I didn't even need to scroll further to know no one else was named, just me. I stood there, holding my black coffee like it might explain any of this, blinking at my name like I'd hallucinated it, as if I'd somehow imagined an entire fiscal quarter where I'd saved their asses in silence again and again, blocked exposure to 3 unstable counterparties, flagged a convertible note with backdoor dilution language, caught a vendor pipeline cross-wired to a shell flagged by OFAC. All documented, all acknowledged. And then there was the biotech mess. I blocked a $14 facility just before Christmas. They had been giddy about it, slapping together decks about emerging verticals while I was quietly reading the footnotes in SEC Form 10Q filings. That partner? Under federal investigation for reporting irregularities. I flagged it. Finance pushed back. I held firm. Legal backed me, reluctantly. The CEO called me overcautious. 3 weeks later, the biotech stock tanked 72% in a single day. Had Garland signed that facility, we'd be listed as a counterparty in the public filings by Friday morning. Instead, nothing. No exposure, no PR scramble, no shareholder panic, just silence, like it never happened. And now this memo, punishment dressed up like fiscal responsibility, telling me that my expectations were inconsistent? I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I closed my phone, took my coffee, walked upstairs. I passed Logan from finance on the stairs. "Hey, Emily," he said, fake casual. "Guess you saw the freeze memo, just so you know it's not personal." I stopped mid-step. Of course it's not personal. It's strategic negligence, but thanks. He opened his mouth to reply, but I was already moving. No reason to waste words on people who think a risk officer's job is to nod politely while the building's on fire. At my desk, I sat, exhaled, reviewed the audit trail. That memo wasn't just cowardice, it was dangerous. Because when you publicly gut the person holding the keys to your debt structures, you better be damn sure they're replaceable. And I wasn't. They knew it too. That's why my access hadn't been revoked. My system credentials were still live, my content manager clearance untouched. The vault holding the asset schedule still tied to my digital signature, which meant one of 2 things. Either they planned to quietly fix the next fire and pretend I was never needed, or they'd already forgotten how deep the foundation went and that I'd built every line of it like a fault line. Let them walk. Let them talk about alignment. I knew what was coming, not because I wanted it to happen, but because I'd already built the clause that would make it inevitable. I didn't slam the drawer. I didn't mutter some farewell speech. I just set the badge down, gently, like it still deserved respect, and slid it shut. Let them spin their little HR tale later. She left suddenly. Maybe she was burnt out. No, I wasn't burnt out. I was insulted. There's a difference. Packing took 7 minutes. 1 laptop, 1 charger, a zip drive that technically wasn't supposed to leave the building, but then again, neither was my dignity. I logged out of my system at 9:42 a.m. sharp. Not that anyone noticed. Most of the team was heads down prepping reports they didn't even know were misaligned. The entire risk framework was already leaning, just enough to look sturdy if you didn't know where to push. And I knew exactly where to push. Before walking out, I ran a final scan. Not the flashy kind, the forensic kind. I'd coded a passive monitor years ago, buried under a generic legacy backup utility header. It triggered only when certain conditions aligned. Threshold variance in debt exposure, latency in vendor remittance schedules, and most critically, a deviation in covenant reporting frequency. 3 flags lit up. The first? A shell entity called GHL57, created last March. Quiet. Registered in Delaware. Nothing dramatic unless you noticed its silent linkage to a 2019 cross-collateral clause. The same clause I personally drafted, the same clause they just quietly stripped out of the latest board deck. The second was a debt servicing lag, 42 days behind, unannounced. Probably kicked down the road with a bridge note someone forgot to log. Normally, minor. But this one was tied to a vendor system that synced with quarterly performance obligations. Meaning if the bridge note defaulted, a cascade would begin. Small, fast, brutal. The third flag chilled me more than it should have. An intercompany remittance delay between 2 subsidiaries in Hong Kong and Dublin. invisible to most. But that delay meant one thing. Someone upstream was moving funds late, or not at all, and hoping no one noticed. They'd notice soon. I packaged all 3 flags into a clean diagnostic log, time-stamped it, and uploaded it silently to the internal risk archive. Then I opened the asset interlock schedule, the full one. 5 years of tracking, cross-default maps, counterparty breach triggers, clause history, all the ugly webbing that turned a simple loan into a corporate time bomb. I uploaded a read-only version to the global audit folder. It didn't overwrite anything, didn't alert anyone, just existed, waiting, like a loaded weapon someone forgot they were sitting on. Then I encrypted the original under my private key and archived it externally, not to leak, not to blackmail, just to remember. I stood up, walked once around the floor, no goodbyes, no hallway tears, just the quiet click of elevator doors as they closed behind me. My reflection in the brushed steel looked calm, but inside I was already rewinding 10 years of memory, back to when I believed people would appreciate the systems that saved them. The truth? They never noticed the walls I held up, but they were about to notice what happens when they crack. It hit around 11:07 p.m., the way these things always do. You're trying to sleep, you think you've walked clean, and then the little vibration hums on your phone like a pulse from the past. Blind copy, treasury thread, subject line, prelim deck, Q1 board, review materials. I hadn't expected to be looped on anything, not after the memo, not after I'd walked. But muscle memory dies slow, and apparently, someone forgot that my name still lived on a few old autofill lists buried in Outlook macros from hell. So I clicked. It was a chain forward, treasury bouncing around slide drafts for the Q1 board deck, tight formatting, same useless clip art, pages of reassurance language dressed up in spreadsheet chic. But then I hit slide 14, Covenant Health Overview. There it was, chart after chart of debt ratios, performance bands, stress tests, projections, neat, digestible, executable even, except the seizure clause was gone, not missing, rewritten, replaced, sanitized, where the 2019 asset seizure protocol should have been, a clause I bled weekends over after the Devane bond collapse. It was now just boilerplate. Generic, lean fallback language, vague enough to mean nothing and safe enough to slide past directors who didn't ask too many questions. It read like a product manual for a blender. In the event of unanticipated creditor distress, Garland Holdings reserves the right to pursue commercially reasonable remedies. Commercially reasonable. That clause used to have teeth. Real teeth. Clause 7.4c, the one we drafted to trigger automatic liens across shell entities in the event of threshold breaches, was built for systemic containment. It mapped intercompany debt like arterial pressure, one rupture, and it clamped down across 37 flagged subsidiaries. It had saved us twice in 2020, once in 2022, and now, deleted, gone, replaced with a sentence so soft you could swaddle a CFO in it. I scrolled back to the thread origin. First sender, Thomas B., Treasury Director. Timestamp, 10:48 p.m. No CC to risk, no CC to legal, just Treasury, Finance, and 2 junior analysts who probably think cross-default sounds like a yoga position. No revision log, no audit trail, no change metadata in the footer. They didn't overwrite it in good faith. They did it in the dark. And the worst part? They thought no one would notice. I closed the laptop, sat there in the dark with my phone screen lighting the room like a confession booth. Someone was trying to rewrite history. Maybe they thought it was cleaner this way. Less red tape, less legacy paranoia, like Cyrus Wexler called it in his keynote slide 2 quarters back. But you don't get to edit out liability because it's inconvenient. That's not simplification. That's malpractice. And now I had proof. I opened my vault, pulled the original 2019 protocol, time-stamped, notarized, uploaded to our internal control server with hard copies distributed to legal, risk, and the CFO himself. It even had his digital signature, right there next to mine. You can delete the clause from a slide deck, but you can't delete the version that lives in 3 offline archives and a certified backup vault in Utah. I downloaded a copy, just in case. Let them think they buried it. Let them present their pretty charts, because now I wasn't just watching. I was preparing. I lit a candle instead of turning on the light, not for mood, just for focus. There's something about firelight that sharpens your edges, especially when you're about to dig into a system designed to stay forgotten. My fingers moved without thinking. External drive, encrypted volume, archive folder labeled with a joke no one but me would ever get, Wexler protection, spell vfinal.pdf inside the full 2019 asset seizure protocol, drafted post-Devane collapse, notarized, co-signed by legal, and buried deep in a subfolder after the market recovered and everyone got bored of governance again. But I hadn't. I don't forget the cracks. I catalog them. Clause 7.4c stared back at me like an old friend. Should any entity listed under Appendix B breach its specified leverage threshold or lapse in scheduled remittance per outlined cadence, immediate lien enforcement shall be triggered across all listed entities under cross-default interlock, without need for board approval. No room for misinterpretation. No weasel words, just a loaded net strung between 37 legally distinct entities waiting. I scrolled to Appendix B. The names came flooding back. Garland subsidiaries, shells, holding core, each mapped with unique identifiers and trigger thresholds. Not alphabetical, by exposure type. Because that's how the bleed happens. Not all at once. Just one small slip. An overlooked remittance, a mistimed wire, a trigger clause buried on page 86 of a vendor agreement. And there, midway down the list, was one I didn't recognize from the original drafting period. GH Holdco 57, new, quietly inserted during the 2024 expansion window. No footnote, no revision trail, but linked explicitly to a 3.5x leverage cap and 90-day remittance cadence. I opened the debt servicing schedule from the last quarter, pulled up their remittance records. 92 days, late, just late enough. And that one delay didn't just put GH Holdco 57 at risk, it tugged the entire net. Because under Clause 7.4c, the cross-default wasn't about who failed. It was about if anyone did. And someone had. I sat back, heart steady. They'd walked me out thinking I was just a risk officer who got too serious about her spreadsheets. Someone they could soft slap with a salary freeze and expect to fade into LinkedIn oblivion. But what they forgot, what they never understood, was that I hadn't built traps. I built containment. The kind you pray never gets tested. Clause 7.4c wasn't a threat. It was a pressure valve. For the moment the CFO, or some overeager strategist, reached too far and hoped no one would notice the floor starting to buckle. And now, that pressure valve was armed. Because while they'd been playing cleanup with fake decks and blank footers, I'd been running exposure maps on a shell they never thought would matter. Until now. They'd pried out the clause thinking it was legacy dead weight. What they really did was disarm their own parachute. And I was holding the ripcord. They thought I was gone. That was their first mistake. At 8:47 a.m., the boardroom lights at Garland Holdings flickered on. Someone set out coffee. Someone else fiddled with the HDMI feed. Phones silenced. Smiles rehearsed. The quarterly theater about to begin, decked out in bullet points, charts, and selective memory. And quietly, unnoticed, I logged in from a cabin 2 states away, still wrapped in a hoodie, sipping burned diner coffee, watching the sun climb over frozen trees. My content manager credentials were still active. Nobody had revoked them. Nobody had even checked. I was the one who had built half the permission structures to begin with, and no one ever rewrote the scripts if they didn't know they existed. They'd yanked my title, frozen my salary, scrubbed my clause from the deck, but they hadn't changed the locks. At 8:53 a.m., I uploaded a single slide into the live boardroom materials portal, the one that syncs automatically across every iPad in that sterile, glass-lined room. No warning, no subject line, just a file labeled Clause 7.4c. Cross-default activation forecast slide title in bold, unreported breach via GHL 57 entity. Subheading, Trigger threshold passed, Decon 29, 2024. Cascade risk assessment active. Below that, a cascading map of all 37 linked entities color-coded. One line lit red, 4 others amber. The rest, flickering like dying stars. And at the bottom, a notation in legal type. Original clause, notarized and validated 2019. Last confirmed active, Q4 2024, per audit chain. Clean, Unemotional, sharp as glass, not a threat, a fact. At 8:57 a.m., the audit log confirmed full sync. The slide was opened on every device, viewed by all 6 directors. A silent ripple in a perfectly scripted morning. No explosion, just a pause. A pause long enough to crack everything open. Because unlike finance's glittering charts and curated optimism, this slide wasn't up for debate. It was a switch. Flipped, irreversible, and the clause was live. They could ignore it, but the GC wouldn't. Legal's job isn't to feel safe, it's to know when they're not. And this clause was the nightmare scenario. The one you mentioned during diligence calls with a nervous chuckle and pray never activates. And it just had. The call hadn't even started yet. I closed my laptop. Didn't watch the feed. Didn't need to. Because sometimes revenge doesn't need volume. Just one quiet moment where the room reads your slide and realizes they don't even know where the exits are. It was supposed to be a victory lap. The CFO had his best tie on, even cracked a joke during the roll call. New year, new thresholds, he grinned, all smug confidence, like someone who hadn't slept in a week but thought he could fake it through sheer spreadsheets and bravado. Slide 12, liquidity position. Slide 13, debt coverage. Slide 14, someone coughed. Pause. Said a voice, probably Amanda from strategy. What's this slide? Silence. The CFO blinked, froze. The vein in his neck, always a tell, started to twitch. Oh, he said, chuckling nervously. That wasn't in the original packet. Another voice cut in, sharper, older. Is this some kind of prank? They were looking at it now. Clause 7.4c, cross-default activation forecast, red lines, amber entities. The words unreported breach burned into the bottom corner like a brand. The GC's voice unmuted with a soft click. Tom, she said, cold as frostbite. That clause was still active? The CFO leaned forward, mouth already open, and stammered. We phased it out last year during the... You phased it out? Her tone didn't rise, didn't need to. It was never sunset, she said, flat and final. There's no record of rescission, no board vote, no notice to risk, and definitely no legal sunset filing in the clause ledger. The CFO blinked. His lips opened and closed like a fish trying to breathe through concrete. Someone else asked, Is this the same clause from the Devane incident? The GC answered. Worse. Devane was external. This one's internal breach. Which entity? Someone whispered. GHL 57, another replied. One of the shells from last March, under finance. The CFO exhaled hard. This is being misinterpreted. The remittance lag is minor. The GC didn't even acknowledge him. We've crossed the trigger threshold, she said, voice tightening, which means if we don't proactively disclose this by market close and it leaks, we are exposed to cross-default litigation across 37 entities. A throat cleared. Does anyone know who uploaded it? The CEO asked, low and tense. No one spoke. Of course they knew. They didn't say it, but they knew. Because only one person ever kept that clause alive. Only one person had authored the schedule. Only one person they tried to bury with a salary freeze and a shrug. Me. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. The silence said everything. The power had shifted. Not with a headline, not with a lawsuit, just one ghost slide in the middle of their perfect little story, reminding them that the person they sidelined still held the original blueprint. They built their empire on my protocols. And now, those protocols had come home. Not to burn the house down. Just to prove who'd actually built it. At 10:12 a.m. sharp, almost to the second the board call ended, my inbox chimed. Subject, clarification, and transition. No greeting, no apology, just 8 paragraphs of polished panic dressed as professionalism. The kind of email that says, we're not admitting anything, but we're very aware that we just stepped on a landmine wearing tap shoes. They wanted to connect for a brief discussion regarding recent contractual interpretations. Requested mutual alignment on exposure implications. Asked if I could revisit in good faith the operational legacy surrounding Clause 7.4c. In other words, we didn't think you'd remember what you built. We didn't think we'd need you again. But now the grown-ups are in the room and they're asking where the adult is. I didn't reply right away. I stood, stretched, refilled my coffee, watched a bird land on the frozen railing of the cabin porch, small, calm, free. Then I sat down and opened the payout schedule. Section Vig, last page. There it was. My line. Not in bold, not underlined, but written with surgical precision by yours truly. In the event of an unreported breach tied to executive acquisition or concealed asset incorporation, all protocol authors of original cross-default provisions shall be compensated in accordance with Schedule B. Schedule B, incidentally, being the emergency valuation clause that assigns payout tiers to any protective author whose protocol results in systemic exposure mitigation after sunset. They'd forgotten it existed. I hadn't, so I copied it. Pasted it into a reply. That was the entire email. Just that quote, followed by 2 sentences. My banking details remain unchanged. Kindly confirm remittance timeline. No salutation, no soft edges, and definitely no meeting. Because I didn't need to revisit anything. I had written the damn thing. While they were shaking hands and staging press calls, I was poring over debt layers and mapping breach pathways like a surgeon tracking veins before the first incision. They buried my clause thinking it was dead. But you don't kill a protection protocol. You just forget it's there until it remembers you. The next email came at 10:26 a.m. No subject. Just a one-line reply from legal. We are reviewing Schedule B now. Thank you for your clarity. I closed my laptop. Didn't smile, didn't gloat, because I hadn't won. I'd simply returned to the space they left wide open when they mistook silence for absence. They thought I'd built safety nets. I hadn't. I'd built consequences. It was tucked in like a dirty secret, 2 inches above a page, break in the Q1 filing appendix, right between amortization schedules and something about deferred tax assets. Footnote 47, remediation payout related to cross-default clause activation per 2019 interlock. No name, no figure, no drama, but I knew, because that phrase, per 2019 interlock, was mine. Every syllable, every comma. The language hadn't been touched since the night I drafted it in a locked office with 2 phones ringing and a legal associate crying quietly in the break room because the Devane collapse had just wiped out 12% of our paper value. That clause had lived in shadows for 5 years. No press releases, just quiet power. And now? It was the reason a 7-figure wire had landed in my account at 2:12 p.m. on a Thursday without a single call, meeting, or NDA. Compensation not for loyalty, but for leverage. I was on the porch when I read the filing, bundled in a sweater older than my last 3 bosses combined, boots up on the railing, coffee cooling in the wind. The mountains were dead silent. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything of you, just lets you be. My phone buzzed. It was Amanda from legal. A simple text. Slide of the year. I didn't reply. What was there to say? They'd tried to erase the clause. Instead, it had carved itself into the ledger, undeniable and permanent, just like I designed it to. And me? I didn't need a press release. I didn't need their apology, because in the end, they didn't get rid of me. They proved I was necessary, by their own oversight. I closed the filing. Took another sip. Reached under the table and pulled out the black notebook I kept tucked away for moments like this. Quiet ones, heavy with closure. Labeled the back page, Clause 7.4c. Closed. Then I filed it away, like I'd never left. Like I'd just waited long enough for them to realize what silence costs.